Hello and welcome to the Channel 66 at 6 p.m. newscast. I am your host, Mauricio Cervantes Jr., and today we will be having a special broadcast by T.A.A.C.C, the Take Action Against Climate Change think tank. Today, in collaboration with this group, we will be discussing climate change and its many effects on Australia. First, we will be to discuss some of the physical and environmental changes caused by the drastic climate change in Australia. We will then discuss how Australia's climate change began and the history behind these harsh changes that are coming. Next, we will depict some of the involvement Australia had in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, better known as UNFCCC, and its political involvement in the conferences of parties. Additionally, we will discuss recommendations or changes Australia can make in order to slow and minimize climate change. Hope you enjoy.
I'm Aochi, and I'm an expert in vulnerabilities and opportunities in Australia. And Australia is facing decreased rainfall, mainly in southern Australia, and these rainfall records have showed a marked decrease in precipitation levels since 1994, and this will affect people who rely on agriculture, and ecologically loss or destruction of fish and wildlife habitat due to lower water level, and there will be a depression in economy and health problem will occur. Farmers may lose money if a drought destroys their crops and spend more money on recovering from the loss. Another vulnerability will be rising temperature. There will be more destructive extreme heat events, and bushfires have occurred this century, and it will affect all Australians. And there will be negative impacts on fish and bird population. Extreme heat events affect public health and the electric transmission system, and there will be decrease in crop production. Next is sea level rising, especially in northern Australia. Since the early 1990s, northern Australia has experienced sea level rise up to 7.1 millimeters per year, and the population lives in the coastal region will expose to this. There will be more flooding events, and this will affect crop and livestock. People have to move away from the coastal region and to the central region, which facing changes in lifestyles and local culture. Pressures have been put on the Australian government for reducing or controlling the effects of sea level rising. And one of the opportunities is sea level rise. People who live near the sea and Australians who work on the sea will expose to this. And it will allow some ports to be accessible to boats. And this will increase the biodiversity in that area. And it may facilitate trading between different areas and people having more entertainment activities and better transportation. People will make profit from fishing and trading. There will be more employment opportunities in the area. Another vulnerability is sea surface temperatures increased. The sea surface temperature has warmed by 0.9 degrees Celsius since 19th centuries, and there is a great impact on the Great Barrier Reef. And this increase in temperature leads to decline in reefs, and there will be less tourism and a negative view of the country. There will be decrease in currency from lack of tourism. And another vulnerability is milder temperatures. This will affect. There will be colder temperatures. The colder temperatures will becoming milder, and snow season is ending earlier. Australians who live in the mountains will expose to this vulnerability, and there will be enhanced agriculture, especially in wine industry. And longer growing season will occur. People can move into mountains, and there will be a change of local culture to more agriculture-based. The wine industry will bring tourism, and agriculture commodities will flourish. There will be a decreased snowfall in the mountains of Australia. And people who live in the mountains will expose to this vulnerability, and there will be wildlife migration occurred in this region. And there will also be a change of lifestyle. Decrease in tourism during winter season will cause unemployment among Australians who live in the mountains. Another vulnerability is ocean acidification. Oceans in the Great Barrier Reef are decreasing in pH level. People that fish at the Great Barrier Reef for a living will have impacts from the acidification. There will be a decrease in marine life will make it more difficult to obtain seafood. People that live off of marine life will have to change their lifestyle to adapt this change, and there will be a decreased fishing will assault the economy and decrease exports. One of the opportunity is decreased snowfall. Australians who experience yearly snowfall and those who lived in the mountains will be impacted. There will be a decreased snowfall. A decreased snowfall will cause an increase in tourism, and ecologically will allow animals to survive in milder weather. And Australia's economy will be benefit from increasing tourism. Tourism and agriculture will increase, allowing for more employment and increasing revenue in surrounding economy.
My name is Matt Byrne, and I'm an expert on climate change history in Australia. Australia was colonized in the 18th and 19th centuries, and as the British entered the country, they brought with them the Industrial Revolution. However, before the Revolution, original Australians, called Aboriginals, were self-supporting nomads. They lived off of the land hunting and gathering. A few groups were known for being excellent shepherds, raising sheep for meat and wool. Their economy was very limited and was mainly based off of trade between different groups of Aboriginals, but there was no market. Once the British developed their first colony, railroads were built to aid in transportation. Railroads opened up new territory that allowed for the expansion of agriculture. With more food being produced and gold being discovered, the population in Australia greatly increased. The Industrial Revolution provided Australia with many industries that they didn't have before: textile industry, iron-making industry, and refined coal. Australia became a massive contributor to the world economy because of the Industrial Revolution. Compared to other countries, Australia is currently producing majority of the carbon emissions along with the United States of America. Railways began to cover Australia in 1831, and with that came the beginning of an extensive dependence on fossil fuel burning. Then Australians began working in factories producing textiles, iron, and refined coal. Each of these processes began using more fossil fuels to power the creations of these products. Over time, Australia has steadily increased the amount of fossil fuels they burn and continue to do so today. Automobiles later became a factor that now holds a great percentage of the fossil fuels used. Australia is the 8th largest energy producer. Australia is the 2nd largest coal exporter in the world, the 3rd largest liquid gas exporter, and Australia produces $4 billion in revenue from coal. As European colonists expanded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, deforestation, or land clear, occurred mainly on the most fertile soils nearest to the coast. In the 1950s, southwestern Australia was largely cleared for wheat production. In the 1970s, the greatest rate of forest clearance have been in the southeastern Queensland, northern New South Wales, and Victoria. Approximately 50% of Australia's forests have now been completely cleared or severely modified. More than 80% of eucalypt forests in particular have been altered. 70% of Australia's native vegetation has been cleared or modified in the past 200 years. Queensland has the highest deforestation rates in the world in the last 30 years. Remaining forests are highly fragmented, which means their ecosystems are being destroyed. Aboriginals have been marginalized throughout history and are most directly impacted by climate change because of their intimacy with nature. Their carbon footprint is significantly smaller than other lifestyles, but they have a limited ability to adapt to climate change impacts because of their historical relationship with the land and their religion. Rural living Australians have a significantly smaller carbon footprint than other Australians and make a much smaller income. They are highly dependent on Earth to give them what they need to survive and are therefore much more susceptible to climate change and will be impacted severely. City-dwelling Australians have a fairly large carbon footprint and make a large income. They rely on carbon-powered transportation, electricity, and housing to live and making a living. They have a larger capacity to adapt to climate change impacts than many other Australians. However, they have become dependent on the devices that are powering climate change, such as cars, phones, and manufactured products. How does climate change affect vulnerable populations in Australia? Climate change will have significant impact for Australians' health as while high temperatures and disrupted water supplies will affect crops. In addition, the warming and acidification of oceans will affect Australia's fisheries. The sick, elderly, and poor. Warming temperatures fuel extreme weather events, help spread disease, and disrupt food and water supplies, which directly affects its population because they are most vulnerable to these issues with weak immune systems and lack of access to health care. Farmers. There are declines in crop yield and livestock production due to drought caused by warmer temperatures, which would cause them to go bankrupt and destroy Australia's agricultural economy. Fisheries. As a result of increasing CO2, commercial fisheries are now confronted with unknown future impacts from acidification, which would cause them to go bankrupt and destroy Australia's agricultural economy. Aboriginals. Aboriginals in Australia were hardest hit by climate change, with higher rates of disease likely and spiritual suffering too when forced to see their ancestral lands ravaged. Women are most severely affected by climate change and natural disasters because of their social roles and because of discrimination and poverty. 5 trade-offs that Australia should be prepared to make in relation to climate change. Companies will need to cut back on the amount of carbon-based emissions released into the atmosphere, which might lead to a reduction in the economy. Australia will have to make increased efforts to promote more efficient uses of water, which will require increased government spending. Australia might be able to provide discounts on purchasing electric cars. Unfortunately, this will force many factory workers into unemployment. Australia might consider exclusively selling Energy Star products. The downside of this is that it will kill all other businesses that do not produce Energy Star products. Other energy-efficient programs would be to provide free recycling service to all Australians, which would also come with heavy taxing on the city.
My name is Xiaochang, Zheng, and now I want to talk the Australia's past involvement in the UNFCCC. Australia signed and was ratified by the UNFCCC in 1992 and entered into the force 2 years later in 1994, along with many other countries. Initially, Australia did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol during the 2005 Montreal COP because of their large activity in coal production and the negative impact it would have on their economy. Australians soon began rallying to support climate change, and therefore, in November of 2007, Kevin Rudd, the Australian Prime Minister, declared that Australia would take steps to reduce their greenhouse gases emissions, and they later on went on to support the ratification of Kyoto Protocol during the second commitment period in the COP in Durban. In August of 2015, Australia created an intended nationally determined contribution to a new climate change agreement to bring forward in the Paris COP. The goal of the agreement was that Australia would not only reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions, but also develop actions to support the emissions reduction fund that would allow Australia to research other effective energy resources. The agreement also led to Australia creating a national climate resilience and adaptation strategy come the end of 2015 for them to individually take a stand against climate change. For the white paper, the Australian government announced in the white paper that emissions from the energy industrial processes and non-legislative sectors would be covered under the scheme from July 2011. Emissions from forestry would be included on a voluntary basis from July 2010. The government has since announced that agriculture will be excluded from the CPIs indefinitely, and agricultural offsets schemes develop emissions from legacy waste. Decommission means the existing stock of synthetic gases and land use change will also not be included in the CPIs. Reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation was first discussed in 2005 by the UNFCCC at its 11th session of the COP and received substantial attention from the UNFCCC and the attending community at COP 13. December 2007 in Bali, where the first substantial decision on IDD Plus was adopted. Australia has helped funding IDD Plus with $200 million to support international efforts for reducing deforestation and forest degradation, including an additional 32 million towards first start for IDD Plus in Indonesia under the Indonesia-Australia Forest Carbon Partnership, and there remains an unallocated amount of 45 million in international forest carbon initiative funds. And the target in Paris conference, Australia has set an ambitious target to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, which builds on our 2020 target of reducing emissions by 5% below 2000 levels. Also, in the same Paris conference, it was announced that Australia made a commitment to donate 1 billion over 5 years in efforts to help developing countries reducing their emissions. Also, Australia's donations will be towards the Green Climate Fund. Durban Conference of Parties, Australia agreed with the Cancun Agreement on adoption, stating that countries need to work together to aid the developing countries that face losses and damages due to reducing the impacts of climate change. Due to this, Australia has donated resources and money to help reduce the opportunity costs these developing countries have. And Australia's current involvement in UNFCCC. Today, Australia is making great strides to prevent climate change and prepare for the changes that climate change is going to bring. Currently, Australia is one of the most supportive and next one countries to lie behind UNFCCC and is an active supporter of the Kyoto Protocol. The Australian government itself beyond the many countries as a whole has made individual goals for themselves to actively combat climate change. Australia's political platform supports preventing climate change because of the diversity of each region of Australia and their history. Many of the areas would face severe consequences from sea level rising and their main tourist attraction. The Great Barrier Reef has the potential to be destroyed if action isn't taken against climate change. Australia's tourism economy has just as large of an impact as their core industry, and that enables them to be able to prevent climate change. As Australia is a well-colonized and developed country, yet relatively unreliant on industries other than tourism, and therefore are willing to contribute to prevent the issue.
I'm Emily, and I'll be discussing a few recommendations that our think tank has developed to combat climate change. Climate change is an issue all countries face around the world. A recommendation for Australia is that they create a national carbon budget to help fund research and invest in technological advances in preventing climate change. The budget will also allow companies to receive monetary incentives if they incorporate technology to have a lower carbon footprint by reducing emissions. The money in this fund can also support developing countries as they continue to grow, yet maintain a stable carbon footprint. The national carbon budget would allow for Australia to give price incentives to individual households and factories in order to encourage a decrease in transportation, electricity use, and inefficient machinery that is high in carbon emissions. Climate change can be prevented at the cost of tax breaks and monetary incentives established by the Australian government. One effect of creating the national carbon budget is that it would reduce government funding for other agencies and would increase Australian taxes. This may influence future generations by increasing the cost of living and loss of agencies. However, the budget has the possibility to be beneficial to the upcoming Australian generations by employing future engineers and climate analysis to develop technology and strategies in preparing for climate change and its effects. The young Australian generation has the potential to combat climate change in both factories and households. Focusing on the vulnerable populations in Australia, including fisheries, Aboriginals, the Australian natives, and women, they all may face difficulty with higher taxes and receiving less governmental funding and will therefore have to make more profit in order to function. However, the governmental funding may be restored if action is taken to establish technology that prevents climate change in households and farms. The future generations of Aboriginals and women may benefit from these recommendations because there will be many job opportunities for those interested in designing technology to prevent climate change. Continuing with vulnerable populations, elderly people may be at a disadvantage in the recommendations with the lack of support from the federal government, with funds being given to the national carbon budget. This small setback, however, can be outweighed by employing poor people and giving them the opportunity to go to school to become a climate analyst or engineer. Farmers, like fisheries, may also face difficulty in the wake of the recommendations being implemented because of a decrease in governmental funding. The decrease in this funding can be restored by technology that reduces emissions on the farms, and therefore allowing the farmers to gain profit through monetary incentives.
Thank you, Aochi, Matt Byrne, Andy Zheng, and Emily Kittendorf for the fantastic presentation on climate change in Australia. There are many opportunities that climate change will enable in Australia. However, with these changes come many downfalls. It should be our number one priority to aid future generations of Australia, and taking action against climate change can help this cause. Thankfully, the Australian government understands the issue of climate change and, as in the past, continues to support funding that combats climate change. Today, the recommendations given are a few of what T.A.A.C.C and other think tanks believe need to happen to keep Australia from suffering from the impacts of climate change. As you can tell, climate change is an issue each of us need to consider. While the Australian government is responsible for the majority of controlling climate change, each of us can do our part by reducing travel, using energy-smart appliances, and conserving electricity by unplugging unused electronics. There are many organizations that can also use your help in promoting less deforestation, conserving of the Great Barrier Reef, and lobbying of the government for each cause related to climate change. Thank you for joining us. It has been a pleasure having y'all. This has been Mauricio Cervantes Jr. with the 6 p.m. newscast for Channel 66. See you next time.